this is Ben. This is another edition of React Hacks, and today I want to show you this pagination feature that I've added to my e-commerce site. And pagination takes your index page, a page that would normally display all of the items in my inventory, and splits them up evenly into multiple pages. So you can see I've got 8 here. And if you click on the next arrow, or if you click on the previous arrow, you're going to see two different items from my inventory until we reach the end, and eventually we've seen all of the items there. It's a really neat way of keeping your website looking clean so that you're not displaying like hundreds of products on a single page. You're just doing a few at a time. This was a fun feature to build, and it had a lot involved with it. And I kind of broke down this large problem into three smaller problems. The first thing I did was figuring out how to get a count of all of the items in my inventory. And that's important because for an index route, I could have returned all of the information from all of the products in my inventory, but all I need was the count. So instead of getting all of that information, which would have taken up a whole lot of memory and possibly more time, I needed to find a way of just getting the count. So that was the first problem. Then the second problem involves dynamic routing, and you'll notice that here I've displayed the page we're on, and that's going to correlate with the URL that's up here in the address bar. And so when you change the page, so is that URL. And I'm not going to hard code in these numbers. I want to figure out a way to dynamically route these pages. And so that's the second problem. And the third problem is kind of what you see on the screen here, and that is how do I get the correct items to display onto the screen? So I'm going to take you through the code and show you how I figured out how to solve those problems. The first was how to get a count, and what I've done is with my Ruby on Rails backend API, I am going to create a route called items counts, and I'm telling my server to listen for a GET request. And so when it does get that request from items count, go to items controller and then run this function called count. And what that does is goes to this function here called counts, and there's a method built inside Ruby called counts. And I'm going to use it on my items model, and all that's going to do is return a count of all of the items in my inventory and then render that for me. When we look at the front end, you'll see, I believe that's here on pagination, or on, where did I use that? Item count, yeah. So you'll see here that I've made a GET request to that endpoint items count, and I'm saving that here. And what I'm going to do is a little bit of math here where I take the number of items I want displayed on the page and use that as the denominator for this item count here. And from that, I'm going to figure out the number of pages that I need displayed. So when I have this 8 here, I didn't just hard code in the number. What I did is I took that count and then divided by the number of items that I wanted displayed. And so now I've dynamically or programmatically figured out the number of pages that I need. And that's the first problem. The second problem is this dynamic routing, and that involves a few steps. The first is, how am I going to get this index route to display for different path names here? Because if you go to the home page where there's nothing in the URL, I want the items to display. Or if you click on one of the pagination links and now we have items / a number, I want the items to display. And likewise, if you just click on this items link here in the nav bar, again, I just want those items to display. So how am I going to get this index route to show up for 3 different routes? And then how am I going to get the different pagination pages to show up in the correct order? And that starts here in app.js. This is kind of the parent component for all of the components that render onto this screen. And inside of it, I'm using a React router, which comes with this switch component. And inside of switch, I have all of these route components. And those routes are going to render a different component depending on the path name in the URL. So for items, I have this array down here, which for /items and for /, which is the home page, I'm going to render the component's item page. And for the dynamic routing, it's really this first route that's important because it's going to be items followed by this ID, and I'm going to use that variable to figure out what page I'm on And then I'm going to pass down that page to my pagination and items components so they display the correct page and display the right items. If we look at the items page, this is where I'm going to grab that value from the URL using this funky looking string here, or string of methods rather, it's not a string. So you go into your props object and then you look for match and then you look for params and then ID is the name of the variable that I've provided here. And that's going to grab me the value from the URL. So it'll be 1, 2, 3 all the way up to 8. And then I'm going to take that value and pass it down to my pagination component and my items component. Or if you're on the home page or just items and there is no params, then we're going to go ahead and start with page 1. Now we can look at the pagination, and this is the final step in the dynamic routing because I've destructured the page from props, and down here in the component itself, really all it is are two links. One that'll take you to the next page and then one that'll take you to the previous page. And I'm going to determine that by taking the current page that was passed down via props and either subtracting one to it or adding one to it, depending on whether or not you want to go to the next or previous page. And there's one other trick here with this link, and that is this ternary operator. And it's because I wanted to disable the link when you're on the first or the last page. And with this, now I have dynamic routing. So I've solved 2 of the 3 problems, and the third problem is the pagination itself. And that starts with my Ruby on Rails backend, and there is this method called paginate that you can use when you download this gem called will paginate. So you put that in your gem file, you run your bundle install, and then now you can use this method called paginate, and paginate will take a few arguments. The 2 that I'm going to pass to it are the page number that we're on and then the number of items I want displayed. And really that's all you have to do for the back end. I'm quite grateful for this gem. So if we look at the front end, and now we're in the items component, you'll see in my API request, I'm sending it to this endpoint that is items, and then I'm adding this query parameter of page, and I'm going to pass to it the page that was passed down as props. So if we go back to the items controller, you'll see I have this params of page, and that's where it's going to get that value from. It's from that query parameter. So it'll know what page we're on, and then print the 2 items that are supposed to display on that page. And I'm going to make an API request. I'm going to serve that information in state, and then once I have that information, I'm going to map over all of the items in state and then create this item component, which just displays the details from that particular item. And the last thing I want to point out is inside my dependency array, I'm adding page because every time that we go to a new page in my pagination component, I want this API request to run one more time so I get the correct 2 items on the page. So I had a whole lot of fun building this feature. It involved work in the back end, it involved work in the front end, and it just came together really well by taking this really large problem and breaking it down into those smaller problems until eventually I figured out how to build this feature. So, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.